Welcome to Radio Poland. I'm Michał Owczarek of the English section, and I'd like to welcome in our studio Peter B. Doran, the Vice President of Research at the Center for European Policy Analysis, CEPA. It's great to have you in the studio today. Thank you for accepting our invitation. Probably it would not be hospitable question, but you are one more piece of evidence of an enhanced political presence by US officials in Poland, because there have been reports of 5 senators coming down to Poland, speaking to the Polish president. There have been reports of the US ambassador allegedly privately meeting the leader of the Law and Justice Party, Jarosław Kaczyński. And there have also been reports on some pressure, US pressure, being put on the Polish government over the constitutional crisis. Do you think that something is really going on behind the scenes?
I should hope so. This is what friends do when they've been friends for a long time. The Center for European Policy Analysis, who I work for, has been active for over a decade now at trying to promote close and enduring ties between the United States and Central European countries like Poland. This was at a time when Poland had just entered NATO, had just entered the European Union, and there was a perception that we needed to have closer ties. And we have. We've built them up over a decade now, and even longer prior to that. And like any situation, when there are questions that friends have, they talk it out. And I think that's what we're seeing right now.
Okay, but is it really thinkable that the American administration is pressurizing on the Polish government over some political constitutional issues? Is it allowed, simply speaking?
Well, I'll tell you, the view from Washington sees Poland in a very specific way. Washington sees Poland as the most prominent and largest ally we have in this part of the world. There is an intense desire inside Washington to see Poland succeed, whether that's success of the NATO summit coming up later this summer, whether that's the success of the Polish economy, or the vibrancy of Polish society and Poland's democracy. So that's the starting point for, I believe, any of these discussions. The U.S. government wants Poland to succeed, and how that plays out is now what we're watching. But I think there is a large reservoir of enthusiasm and goodwill towards Poland as the starting point for any of these discussions.
Don't you think that the Polish government should be infuriated, angry about such, let's say, persuasion, gentle persuasion from the Americans, because this is really an issue, yes? And I guess this government considers itself like an independent one and needs no, let's say, needs no grooming or needs no clues from any other governments.
Well, I can tell you as an American, I'm from Arizona originally. And as an American from Arizona, I watch how Poland has viewed its relationship with the European Union. I've watched the questions come out. At what point does our sovereignty stop and our membership in the European Union take over? I think as an American, anyone from the other side of the Atlantic would look at this debate and go, that makes perfect sense to us. We have these questions that we ask of ourselves all the time. So being a long-term observer of Polish politics, being actively involved in a lot of the policy debates that shape the U.S.-Polish relationship, this makes a lot of sense to me. What I'd like to see is a constructive conversation that ultimately results in a stronger Poland. I think that checks and balances are an important part of that. Checks and balances are a question that Americans are talking about right now in our own political context as a result of our own presidential campaign. So this is, again, something that friends, these are problems that friends share and problems that friends talk out.
You have mentioned the forthcoming NATO summit in Warsaw in July, and there have been some media reports that Warsaw may even be, let me use a strong word, blackmailed with not staging the summit if we don't agree to some reforms or, let's say, enacting any good laws that would go in the direction of resolving the constitutional crisis.
Well, you used a strong word, so I'll use three, and in doing so, I will actually break the ironclad law of being an analyst, and that is never make predictions. But I'm prepared to, right now in this discussion, to make a prediction, and that's three words: never gonna happen. I don't believe that any of these discussions about the NATO summit being moved or discussions about blackmail, I don't think any of these things are ever going to happen. I think the NATO summit is going to proceed here in Warsaw, and I believe that there is a desire, a strong desire, particularly among the Pentagon, to see the NATO summit succeed. Because in succeeding, it will validate a thesis that all of NATO and the United States together made a long time ago. And that was that Central Europe would matter, that our alliances in Central Europe would make us stronger rather than weaker. And I think the success of the NATO summit later this summer will validate that thesis. That's what folks in the U.S. want to see, and I think we'll be able to achieve it.
Have you got any insider's knowledge about what is going to be agreed upon during that summit?
Well, I think right now we could probably write the NATO communique or between ourselves and on the back of a napkin. I think it's pretty obvious what the communique is going to say. It's going to be very similar, I would anticipate, to what previous NATO communiques talked about. The one thing that I'm going to look for is to see how serious NATO takes the threat, not just from the South, which is real, but also from the East. It is very clear over the past few years and since Wales that security pressures and dangers from the East are urgent and growing. That impacts Polish security, and because of Article 5 of the Atlantic Treaty, it impacts American security. So I'd like to see that aspect of the communique and that aspect of the conversation achieve a significant degree of prominence at the NATO summit.
Okay, you haven't mentioned this enhanced or permanent presence of the U.S. troops or of the NATO troops in Central and Eastern Europe. Do you think it's going to happen? Do you think it's going to be agreed upon during that summit?
I would love to see it happen. I have suspicions. Remember, this is a big alliance with a lot of viewpoints. I think the Warsaw Summit could be a historic summit if there was a clear and resounding endorsement for a permanent NATO presence and specifically a permanent U.S. presence in Poland.
But the formal enhanced or permanent presence is not allowed in a view of international treaties, I guess. So how are we going to get this done?
Well, that's one issue that I don't see resolved at the Warsaw Summit. You're speaking, of course, about the NATO-Russia Founding Act, which represented a gentleman's agreement of sorts, that there would not be a long-term security presence in Central Europe if NATO expanded eastwards. That was contingent upon the fact that Russia wouldn't invade its neighbors or annex the territory of countries like Ukraine. So obviously the strategic conditions have changed. That changes the basis of the agreement. But I don't think there's enough political consensus inside the alliance to roll back the Founding Act at this point. What we could look forward to is a more robust presence, a persistent presence in Central Europe by the United States and by NATO forces, more active training exercises that prepare for real-world conditions that we've seen emerge in this part of the world. That would make NATO a lot stronger and a lot better prepared to deal with the uncertainties that we're seeing in the 21st century.
Okay, let me now change the topic, okay, for one that is now a hot issue and a hot topic in Europe, especially after the Brussels attacks, yes. There have been reports in American media that Belgian security forces, or for that matter, European security forces, are like babes in the woods with counterterrorism. So do you think that America is really infuriated with the ways this issue is being tackled in Europe?
I read that report just like everybody else, and I think it's best not to draw any deep conclusions from an unsourced comment that no one will actually stand up and own. I'll tell you, I think some folks at the State Department probably had a really rough morning this morning dealing with the blowback from that. What I will say, though, is that we learned this lesson in the United States. It is very hard to break down the walls between bureaucracies. It's very hard to get intelligence agencies to talk to each other. It looks like the situation in Brussels was complicated by a lot of bureaucratic walls between agencies. After the United States suffered the terrible 9/11 attacks, one of the first steps that U.S. officials took was to increase information sharing, increase cooperation between agencies and law enforcement. And I think one of the lessons that Europeans are drawing right now is that similar kinds of activities, increasing intelligence sharing, increasing cooperation between law enforcement, is key in order to keep Europeans safer and in order to prevent attacks like this from occurring again.
Okay, so you think that we are going to see more cooperation between Europe and the US where counterterrorism is concerned?
I'll tell you right now that Americans took note of how much solidarity Europeans showed towards the United States in the wake of 9/11. Americans have a deep well of goodwill towards Europeans as they are suffering these horrific attacks. At a policy level, I anticipate a much greater cooperation between the European Union and the United States on these questions of terrorism.
What are the specific things that Europe could learn from America in the field of counterterrorism?
Well, it looks like one of the problems that we're facing is that when a suspect crosses a national border, information about that suspect isn't shared. That's just one of many steps that can be taken to increase coordination between law enforcement and ultimately make for a safer Europe.
Okay, and probably my last question this time about Donald Trump. Just for a change, because he seems to be taking America by storm. And do you think that we here in Poland should be keeping our fingers crossed for his victory?
If you would phrase it as taking America by storm, another way to look at it is that he's causing many storms of his own inside the U.S. political discourse. Donald Trump is a candidate for president. He's not the only candidate. And one thing that Americans have had to learn is about the anachronistic rules and peculiar aspects of the nomination process. So we're not even talking about the actual presidential campaign here. We're just talking about the way one party picks its candidate to lead them. I would be surprised if he can make the math work for him. It looks like we could be on the verge of a historic event this summer. We might not know who the Republican nominee is until after the convention. And that will be decided at the convention. This is unusual. It's something that has not happened in the United States since 1952. So you really have to go back to the history books. History could very likely be made this summer, and we will see if Donald Trump is the nominee. There's still a long way to go. He can't be mathematically eliminated before June 7th in the U.S. campaign cycle. He can't seize the nomination for himself before that date either. So the field is still open.
Can you think of let's say, one implication that would be good for Poland if Trump wins?
Well, I do take a lot of caution by what he said about NATO. Some of the things he said, that the United States should spend less in Europe, should invest less in NATO. That's not good for Poland. I would point out that this is part of a wider debate in the United States, asking the question, why should Americans invest in Europe when Europeans don't seem to be investing in their own defense, in their own security? Poland is a bold example of the countertrend, spending a lot of money on defense, preparing for the real kinds of threats that we face today. And so as an American who's actively involved in this debate, a lot of times I point to Poland and say, not true, look what's happening in Poland, look what's happening elsewhere in countries like Estonia. So this is part of a wider debate in the United States, but that debate is not settled. And so as a poll, watching this discussion, I would pay close attention to how it plays out over the next 6 months.
Okay, so as we are running out of time,
Great.
So I would like to thank you very much.
Of course.
So my guest today was Peter B. Doran, the Vice President of Research at the Center of European Policy Analysis, CEPA.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Pleasure to be here.